So, did you get that, honey bunch? Okay. All right. We're in 2 Kings 14 and 15, but I got to be honest with you. I couldn't do it. So, I mean, I could read it to you, but you can read it. It's a whole bunch of Israel king successions. It really isn't going to make any sense to you when we're done. So I decided that since we're going to Jonah and we're going to minor prophets, I'd take a little time to kind of do a little Old Testament survey this morning because honestly, I just couldn't do it. So I tried, but it was just going to bore you all to tears. So, so anyway. So I thought we'd look a little bit at this, stuff we've been talking about, stuff we're going to talk about. You know, the Old Testament, as the New Testament, is broken into divisions. Not chronological, of course, just like the New Testament. No chronological order to it whatsoever, except in the beginning. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, first 5 books, the Pentateuch, they call it, Pentateuch, however you want to pronounce it. Books of law. Moses supposedly is credited with authoring those books. But after you get from that, it still stays fairly chronological through Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Maybe not Ruth necessarily. Kings and Chronicles, a lot of the same stuff in there. But then when you get to Ezra and Nehemiah are when the Jews returned to Jerusalem. We'll talk about that date a little bit. So they're really late. They're after the Babylonian captivity when the Jews went back to Jerusalem. Ezra went back to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah went back to rebuild the wall. In the Hebrew Bible, it's one book. In our Bible, it's separated into 2 books, Ezra and Nehemiah. Esther is a post-captivity book, and that's really Esther is really kind of an interesting book, but because of where it is. Because Esther, you see, when the Babylonians took the Jews out of Jerusalem, when they captured Jerusalem, 596, captured Jerusalem, they took all the Jews out. And then Jeremiah had prophesied that in 71 years they would return to Jerusalem. That's what Daniel was saying. The time was at hand, and he knew it was time. Well, when the Medes took over, the Persians and the Medes took over, they allowed the people to go back home. And that's what happened with Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem. The king said, you can go home. The Babylonians took them all away. The Medes and the Persians, King Cyrus says, you can go back home if you want. So a lot of them did. A lot of them didn't. A lot of them stayed where they were. Esther's one who stayed. So, you know, the truth of the book of Esther is that Esther and all the Jews could have just went back to Jerusalem. They didn't really have to stay there where they were. So it kind of adds a little bit of a different light to the book of Esther. Esther was a she was Xerxes was the king, remember, of Esther? And Artaxerxes and Xerxes, and he was a Mede. So, you know, she could have went back. They could have just all left and went home, essentially. No, there was nothing holding them there. They weren't being held in captivity. The captivity part had basically ended. So Esther is later than that, quite a bit later. Esther is pretty late chronologically in the New Testament. The poetry book, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. You know, that's kind of the middle section. Job is very old. Some people think it's pre-flood. So, you know, and that's a matter of debate. I kind of think that, but some scholars disagree. Job was definitely a patriarch. Job didn't live under the law of Moses, so he was definitely pre-Moses. There's a lot of things in the book of Job that allude to the fact that he was pre-flood, pre-diluvial, they call it. Job's really, really an old book. Job was a patriarch. Job talks about things that can almost allude to dinosaurs if you read the book of Job. And so, you know, Job's old. So Job's one of the older books of the Old Testament for sure. Song of Songs, a lot of people think it shouldn't even be in the Bible. It's in the Hebrew canon. Supposedly one of the greatest pieces of ancient poetry that exists. We never really look at it, but that's your poetry books in the middle. Most of them were David, but not everything. Even in Psalms, there's Psalms in there that aren't David's. 90th Psalm is Moses' Psalm. So some of the Psalms is really, really ancient text, really older than David, really, really ancient. Proverbs attributed mostly to Solomon, but not all. Ecclesiastes to Solomon, Song of Songs to Solomon. Your major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the Lamentations of Jeremiah, if you've got an old book. New Bibles call it Lamentations. Of course, new books, if you got an old Bible, it's Song of Solomon. In newer Bibles, it's Song of Songs. So that changed too. And then Isaiah was a northern kingdom prophet, the only major prophet that was a northern kingdom prophet. We'll look at his dates a little bit. He prophesied to the northern kingdom. He was the prophet of Hezekiah. If you remember the story of Hezekiah that was going to die, and the Lord caused the sun to go back, and Hezekiah got 15 years, and Manasseh was born to him when he was 12 years old, and Manasseh was one of the most evil kings of Israel. Isaiah was a prophet of Hezekiah. Different people through the ages, there were different prophets. Nathan was David's prophet. Isaiah was Hezekiah's prophet. So there were different prophets throughout history. So Isaiah, as far as major prophets, is the older prophet. Jeremiah prophesied before the capture of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and then the Lamentations of Jeremiah was written from a grotto in Jerusalem after the destruction of Jerusalem. So Jeremiah is a pre and during captivity prophet. Ezekiel is a post fall of Jerusalem prophet. Ezekiel actually prophesied from Babylon. So Ezekiel became a prophet after Jerusalem was carried off by the Babylonians. Daniel is a post fall of Jerusalem prophet. Daniel prophesied from Babylon. That's the story, right? Went to Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, changed their name to Babylonian names. He's the one that knew it was time to go back because of the prophecy of Jeremiah that they would go back in 71 years. He knew it was time to go back. He implored the angel. Gabriel came, and the angel told him that he had been busy with the king of Persia, but he'd come to answer his question and that they would go back. And then the Medes came in not long after, during the time of Daniel. The Medes came in, and that's when the Medes were such a strong army that the Babylonians didn't fight. They just opened the gates and let them come in, so there was no destruction, there was no killing. God preserved his people. God allowed them to go back to Jerusalem. So there's a lot of history in there. Your minor prophets are a lot harder to figure out. Hosea, your last three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, are generally after the destruction of Jerusalem. We'll look at that a little bit. Joel, Jonah, Hosea, Amos, Obadiah, hard to date. People try, pretty tough. Micah, pretty hard to date. Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, pretty hard books to date. Where they actually fall. They don't really give a lot of historical markers in minor prophet books, so it's hard to say this is where this was, this is where this was, but we kind of try to fit it in. So that's kind of how it's laid out, your Old Testament. So it's not, like I said, not chronological. And the truth is most books of the Bible were kind of during certain periods of history were written. There's a whole lot of time that nothing was happening, nothing was written. So a lot of these overlap. They run concurrent. So there's two ways we divide the Old Testament, right? Patriarchal age, Mosaical age. Pre-law, post-law. So patriarchs were all those guys who God talked to directly, from Adam to Abraham to all those Old Testament guys that God directly spoke to the heads of households. Those were all patriarchs, all the way up till the time of Moses. Moses was technically a patriarch till the law came down. So, but those guys were all patriarchs. Then when Moses brought the law down from Sinai, that's what we call Levitical age, or the law. And that changed everything, right? We know that. The law came down. God changed the way he dealt with man. The temple was built. Worship was established. Sin was incurred. Things changed after the law. So that's a big division in the Bible, is the giving of the law when the age changed. There's a lot of real pivotal events in the Old Testament. You guess you could go back to the flood, but as far as what affects us, the biggest things that affect us are the promises God gave to Abraham. Starts in Genesis 12, runs all the way, through Genesis, 20, Genesis 19. There's the promises to Abraham. In your seed all nations shall be blessed. Give you the land of Canaan. I'll be your God. You'll be my people. Those promises were important to us. That was what set everything in motion. When God promised Abraham, the Bible came to life. Everything started happening. Until that point, it really didn't. That promise had to come to Abraham. Once that promise came to Abraham, it was set in motion to go to the cross. Things began to happen. So those are really those were big things. The calling of Abraham. The deliverance from Egypt. That was a major event that affected us. The Hebrew nation. God nurturing the Hebrew nation in Egypt. And then the Exodus, we call it. We call it Exodus, book of Exodus, right? The Hebrew Bible, they call it the book of names. But we call it, because it says these are the names of the sons of Israel that God took. These are the names of the sons God took out of Israel. The Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew and the Jews, they call it the book of names. We call it Exodus. So that was a real pivotal thing. Moses takes the children out, the giving of the law. That was a really, really big thing to us, was when Moses gave the law. When God gave the law to Moses, that really set all the New Testament stuff in motion that we know about Christ and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the temple. I mean, there wouldn't have been a temple without the law. The law is what brought all that into existence, from the tabernacle to Solomon's temple, the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians, the rebuilding of the temple by Ezra and Nehemiah, and Jerusalem by Ezra and Nehemiah, and then Herod rebuilding the temple before Jesus, started way before Jesus was born. Herod rebuilding the temple, and was in progress while Jesus was on the earth. The temple, Herod's temple, was in work in progress while Jesus was on the earth. Wasn't completed till after Jesus was crucified, several years after that, and was destroyed in 71 AD. So big points in history. The days of the kings. We spent a lot of time in there over the last 4 years. The kings of Israel, right? The big ones, Saul, we know, David, Solomon, divided kingdom, Jeroboam, Rehoboam, and then we go through all these successions of all these different kings, and we've looked at them, and it gets very confusing. Eventually the Israelites will be carried off. We'll look at that. Judah will stay in existence but be carried off, but the kingly line will stay intact even while they're in captivity, and that lineage will go all the way to Jesus. Judah sustained itself a lot longer than did Israel. We'll look at those dates a little bit. So there's a lot. That was a big thing. Kings came into, before kings we had judges, right? Book of Judges. All the judges, God raised up judges. Samuel was the last judge and priest. He was a judge and a priest. Eli was the priest before him. Samuel was the last judge and priest. After Samuel, he anointed Saul, and Israel became under the leaderships of kings after that. So there was a big shift in Old Testament once we started to get kings. Are there any questions? Any comments? Well, it says the tablets were written front and back, right? So I don't know if it was just the Ten Commandments on the tablets. Got any input on that, Gary? I don't know. There's 637 laws came off Sinai, approximately. Yeah. The Hebrew writer says that we received the law by a mediator, by an angel. So, I guess Moses, by an angel to Moses, by a mediator, right? So There was a lot of law. Yeah, like most say about 637 laws. What? Added to them. Oral law. Yeah, the Mishnah and a lot of Jewish oral tradition. Yeah. Yeah, and the proselyte in certainly didn't give you Jewish status. I mean, they still didn't consider you a true Jew. So, but you were under that and put yourself under that law. Yeah, the law was very specific, and I've read quite a bit about that over the years by some pretty big Hebrew scholars. And one thing they really kind of focus on is the law. Really, God gave the law to make them a nation. The law was about building Israel into that nation. The law wasn't about salvation. The law wasn't about necessarily about this is how you're going to be saved. The law was about making them a nation, and of course it imparted sin, because law does impart sin. Like Gary said, it didn't apply to anybody else unless you proselyted in. It didn't apply to you. It wasn't a universal thing. Right. Sure, there was certainly, he had to tell them, and even from the very beginning when Cain and Abel offered sacrifices, there was a reason they did that. I mean, God had told them to sacrifice. There was a right way to sacrifice, and there had to have been a right way and a wrong way to do it, or God would. So you're right, but in the patriarchal age, we don't look at it as sin so much. We look at it as righteousness. That's really what the Bible says. If you did what God told you to do, you were righteous. Didn't really say you were sinful if you didn't. Moses was, or Abraham was righteous because when God said, leave your land, leave your homeland, leave your people, go into the land I will show you, that was accounted to him as righteousness to God. He did what God said to do. So, but then you read a lot of stuff before the law, like where, Jacob lies with a prostitute and all kinds of other things, and you're like, my gosh, these are patriarchs, they're committing these terrible sins, but the Hebrew writer says, before law there was no sin. So, that's, so it kind of boggles your head just a little bit sometimes when you read that stuff. Huh? There was punishment, and God did punish people. Absolutely. God did punish people and directly punished them in the Old Testament. Absolutely. Yeah. The divided kingdom around 930 BC. Kingdom divides. After Solomon, the kingdom divides to Jeroboam and Rehoboam. That's when the fall of Israel really begins. God turned his face away from them because of their transgressions. God will still contend with them for a period of time, but their days are definitely numbered after the kingdom divides. Israel's carried off by the Assyrians, 721 BC, never to be heard from again. The lost tribes of Israel, we call them, the 10 tribes, all the northern tribes. We've been talking about in 1st and 2nd Kings for the last 2 months, last month anyway, 2 months. All those Israelites, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, those are big northern kingdom prophets. All those Israelites are going to get carried off. Jehu, that's the line of Ahab and Jezebel and Jehu and all these people we've been reading about. 1st and 2nd Kings is 99% northern kingdom stuff. So that was all that northern part of Israel from Judea up, all the way up to the Dead Sea. All the way up to the Sea of Galilee and across there. All that area is going to be captured by the Assyrians. And what's going to happen by the time Jesus is on the earth, Galilee, that region around the Sea of Galilee, is going to become more of a Judah type thing, more of a Jew area, and then Judea, which is Jerusalem, will be Jewish, and then between those two places, all that stuff we read about in the New Testament, between those two places, up here by the Sea of Galilee, and sometimes the Bible calls it the Sea of Tiberias, this area up here, and then Jerusalem down here, which is down kind of by the Dead Sea, and then the Jordan River runs down that side. That area right in there, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan and the Galilean area and the Judea area, that's all Samaria, and the Samaritans are half-breeds. That's because they were carried out by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians left some of them, and the Assyrians came and lived there. So their religion got kind of skewed up by the Assyrians. And so when Jesus in John 4, when Jesus sees a woman at the well, which is probably Jacob's well in Shechem, which is by Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and she says, we worship on this mountain, but you say we ought to worship in Jerusalem, that's Syria, that's Samaria, that's the Samaritans. And Shechem is where the Israelites originally came across from the Jordan, Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, and they came between the mountains, and the priest stood on one mountain and gave them curses, and one mountain and gave them blessings. That's where they buried Joseph, because remember, they carried Joseph around in the wilderness for 40 years, and as soon as they crossed that Jordan River, the first thing they did was bury Joseph, because they were tired of carrying him around for 40 years, right? First order of business, we cross, burying Joseph. We're done carrying him, right? So that's Shechem. That's where Jacob's well is, Shechem. The tomb of Joseph is at Shechem. Shechem is a big, ancient, biblical town, very ancient, biblical town. So that was Samaria. That's where Jesus was, and they had an altar on Mount Ebal, and that's where they would sacrifice and worship. They didn't go to Jerusalem. That was a contention. So the Jews said, you say you got to go to Jerusalem. We say we need to worship on this mountain. Jesus says, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. But the day will come when all true worshipers will worship God in spirit and truth. That's the discourse in John chapter 4. And that's where that is. Judah is defeated by the Babylonians. Fall of Jerusalem, 597 BC. So God contends with Jerusalem for a while. There's reasons for that. One thing is that geographically, Jerusalem is a rocky, bad spot to be. It's not really farmland. It's not really that desirable. So when the Assyrians came in, they didn't really go there. The other thing is that Judah kings paid people off several times. Paid the Assyrians off once with treasures of the temple. Hezekiah really brought the Babylonians, right? Because Hezekiah's life got spared. Remember that? And Hezekiah brought all the Babylonians in. He showed them all the treasures of Judah. And God said, well, good job, Hezekiah. Now they're going to come carry all this stuff off, and you're not going to have anything. That was Judah. The Babylonians came in and took it over, captured them, carried them off, destroyed the temple, destroyed the walls. But in 538 BC, so you can see there's not a long, 597, right? And God said, like in 70 years, according to the prophet Daniel, according to Jeremiah, I'm sorry, in like 69 years, 70 years, I guess it depends on how you read the prophecy, they would come back and rebuild. They would come back to Jerusalem. And so in 538, they came back, about 60 years. They came back. Ezra and Nehemiah came back and rebuilt the wall and rebuilt the temple. And that set in motion the prophecy of Daniel about when Christ would come. Because Christ said, from the time you set the wall, from the time you set the temple, from that time, 490 years, Jesus will be here. The Messiah will come. That's the prophecy of Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel. So when they rebuilt that, it set the prophecy of Daniel in motion, which if you were a Jew, that set the time of the Messiah, the time of Jesus coming. That's what set it, was the time when the wall was set. Or when the temple was set. So that's a prophecy when the sacrifice began again, I should say, right? That was the setting of the time for Jesus to come, according to the prophecy of Daniel. So that's really an important time in history, prophetic-wise. That's why the Jews knew Jesus was coming when he came, was because of all that prophecy of Daniel. That had to do with when the temple was rebuilt. So all that came into play. In 538 BC, they came back, they rebuilt the wall, they rebuilt the temple. The minor prophets throughout this time were warning them to repent, warning them to turn back to God. They were ignoring that largely, weren't paying attention to those prophets whatsoever. Some minor prophets didn't prophesy very long, and some of them, like I said, were before this period in time. Jonah was in Nineveh. That was why Israel was still in existence. Most of those prophets, Joel, Amos, were back in those days. We'll look at that just a little bit. The end of prophecy was about 390 or so BC. So the last prophetic book of the Old Testament was about 400 years before Christ. That was when Malachi was written. So that was the last book chronologically of the Bible. So there's a period between the Testaments, a period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, 300 to 400 years, that basically God didn't say anything. Now we have books. We call them the books of Apocrypha. We have books. I think there's 13 in the middle of there. We don't say they're inspired. They are interesting to read if you ever get bored on a cold winter night, especially Maccabees. I would recommend 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Very gory, very interesting to read. But they're about the Maccabean Revolt. That happened. That was a big thing that's a big thing that happened in Jerusalem between the Old Testament and New Testament that we don't have in the Bible. The Maccabean Revolt was a huge thing. Epiphany sacrificed pigs on the altar. Some people think that was a fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel. And then the Maccabean Revolt was when they threw them out. That was Maccabees, and they threw out the oppressors and reclaimed Jerusalem, and some of the fast days of the Jews have to do with that reclaiming of the temple. That all happened between the Testaments in that 3 to 400 year period, and there's about 13 books in there that are the books of Apocrypha. If you have a Catholic King James Bible, most of the time they include the books of Apocrypha. Otherwise, you can buy them separately or you can Google them. So they do exist. You can read them. But those mostly we call to be historical. There is an interesting thing in the books of Apocrypha, a few interesting things. One about where the Ark of the Covenant is. One of the apocryphal books, I think it might be 1st Maccabees, talks about Jeremiah burying the Ark of the Covenant in a mount in a cave that would never be found, which had been the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, which if that's the case, the Ark of the Covenant exists underneath the dome, the Muslim Dome of the Rock, which if that's the case, of course there's a lot of conflicting views, but that's in the books of Apocrypha, for one thing. So there's a lot in there we don't read. So if you look at Elijah, which is what we've been studying, and that's Samaria, that's Ahab's house, that's Elijah. He starts right up there about 877, 876 BC. That's Jezebel, Ahab's ivory house at Samaria. That's when in Judea we get Jehoshaphat becomes king. Ben-Hadad is the king of Syria or Aram. That's what we've been talking about all this time period in here. So for 7 years, Elijah is on his own up till about 870. Elijah predicts the drought, 3.5 year drought. That's what's talked about in the book of James. And then after that period of time, then Elisha starts to be concurrent with Elijah. So that's what happens in here. Elijah's reigning. Elisha has a 23-year apprenticeship under Elijah. So from the time that Elisha is called in the end of 1 Kings, there's 23 years. He he is the one who has an apprenticeship under Elijah until Elijah gets carried off in a chariot of fire. And that's what we've been studying. This is all the stuff we've been looking at for the last 2 months. The Shunammite's dead son, Elisha did. The poison stew, remember that? We read about that, where he put in the meal and then it was good. The healing of Naaman, the axe head that floated, remember we read about that. The battles, the water miracles, all the things that he does. The Jerome issues the death threat of Elisha because of the famine, says, I'll kill him today. Of course, the famine ends, the 4 lepers at the gate. Remember, we read about that. And at the same time, you got all this other stuff going on in the Judah side of life. Jeroham, we read about him, remember? All the things that he did. And then Ahaziah comes in. We read about all those things going on. So you got 2 different things going on. You got Judah going on. You got Israel going on. Elijah's going along. Elijah's going to die. Elijah goes to heaven in a chariot of fire. That's about 842 BC. Elijah's carried off in a chariot of fire. He says, if you see me leave, you'll get the double blessing. And so he drops his mantle, and Elisha sees him leave and picks up the mantle. So we call Elisha the prophet of the double portion. And Elisha takes the mantle and strikes the Jordan, and the waters dry up, and they know he's got the power of Elijah. And Elisha becomes the prophet, then the northern kingdom prophet. That's before Isaiah. This is before Isaiah. And then, Elisha continues through a long period of time. Elisha was a long-lived prophet. 842 to 865. He was the lone prophet, or the biggest prophet there. He had a long period. A lot of stuff happened. Jehoahaz, all these guys that came into existence during his time. He finally dies. Elisha finally dies. So on our minor prophets, you got Jonah. Remember Jonah? He's the one we all know. We all know Jonah. Jonah's the most popular minor prophet, right? I mean, because he got swallowed by the big fish and goes to Nineveh and Veggie Tales. I mean, we all know about Jonah, right? So Jonah's the big guy. Everybody knows him. Jonah's the big minor prophet because everybody knows about him. But all of them were important. All of them prophesied about different things, mostly about Edom, about Assyria, imminent doom, turn or else. A lot of examples in there about different things. Amos, Hosea, Micah was one of our big ones. These are our northern kingdom prophets, okay? Isaiah, Micah, northern kingdom. So all these prophets were Israel, northern kingdom prophets. But also at the same time, we had Judah prophets. Nahum, Zephaniah, I cut that off, didn't I? Habakkuk, Jeremiah. Those are all Judah prophets. So those are, you got 2 different things going on. And that's just how it kind of works out. So you had some minor prophets that were Judah prophets. You had some minor prophets that were Israel prophets. But these are really the ones that, I don't want to say they're more important, but Isaiah is really messianic. Certain prophets were very messianic, and others weren't. Certain prophets looked to the Messiah, looked to Christ. Other ones didn't. So Isaiah is a very messianic prophet. And that's what my sermon's about this morning, actually. Isaiah is a very messianic prophet. But also Daniel looks towards things to do with Christ, especially when he will come. Daniel's prophecies are so accurate that people who don't believe in the Bible think Daniel was written after the fact, because they don't think that Daniel could have been that right and be written before it happened. That's just a true statement. People who don't believe in the authority or prophetic utterance or the authority of Scripture really believe Daniel was written after the fact, because Daniel's dates are too accurate. So Daniel's prophecies were spot on. I mean, they were spot on, right? You remember the prophecy of the statue and the kingdoms, and how it was the Babylonians, and then the Medo-Persians, and then the Greeks, Alexander the Great. All that came to pass. The Babylonians was the head, remember, and the shoulders was the Medo-Persian Empire that came in, and then after that it was the bronze, the hips, the thighs, the the Greeks. Alexander the Great comes through. Alexander the Great, the Greeks capture all that area, and Alexander the Great comes through. And then the kingdom on the 10 hills, the 10 toes, which is Rome, that sits on the hills. And Rome encompassed all them other kingdoms, and then there was something that smashed that kingdom, that rock, and that was Christ. Daniel's prophecy was spot on. So Obadiah, Ezekiel is, Ezekiel's crazy. I mean, if you just want good entertainment some night, read the book of Ezekiel. If you look up UFO in the back of my Bible, it says see Ezekiel. So, I mean, really, Ezekiel had the wheel in the center of the wheel that moved all the directions. And, Ezekiel he was in Babylon prophesying after the captivity. And, I mean, his stuff's crazy. He's the one that sees into heaven and the throne, and talks about the angels with the wings and covering the eyes. And that's all in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel's wild book, right? So, Ezekiel's a wild book. Haggai, Zechariah has a lot of Zechariah. There's some messianic prophecy in the book of Zechariah, especially in Malachi. Micah has some messianic prophecy. Micah talks about Jesus being born in Bethlehem. Micah 5:2, Jesus to be born in Bethlehem. There's biblical prophecy in that. Isaiah talks about the virgin birth. We'll look at Isaiah in my sermon because I wanted to tie it together with this that's going on. Malachi, one of my favorite minor prophets is Malachi. And that is, and he's pretty late, 420, 397, last book of the Old Testament. He's reign of Xerxes. Is when Malachi prophesied. So Malachi is one of my favorites for sure. Zechariah, one of the few places we see Satan mentioned outside of Job and Genesis. Probably talk about that tonight when we talk about Satan. Any comments about that? There's a lot of stuff in there. Yeah, we don't have it. Bands of prophets, it says, especially around the time of Saul, Samuel, bands of prophets, seers. Even when we looked at Elisha, Elijah, there were prophets, other prophets. Elisha took care of the one prophet when he died, and fed his wife, give the wife the oil because he wanted to take care of him. So, yeah, there's a lot of prophets in Israel. But like Gary said, a lot of prophets we don't have record of, but these are the ones that through history have been preserved, I guess you would say. So a lot of prophets. Anyway, so Malachi, which is one of my favorite Old Testament prophets. I love Malachi. We're out of time. But Malachi, if you look at the end of Malachi, this is right before we had that big 300 or 400 year break between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And Malachi says what? He says, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubble. The day that comes shall burn them up, says the Lord of hosts, so that they will leave them neither root nor branch. In other words, no lineage. But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise, with healing in its wings. You shall go out leaping like calves from the stall. You shall tread down the wicked. They will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I act, says the Lord of hosts. Remember the teaching of my servant Moses, the statutes and ordinances that I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel. Lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse. And, we know that was John the Baptist, right? So right before the end, the last prophetic book of the Old Testament, it basically foretold John the Baptist. Elijah was going to come, and Jesus said, what? John the Baptist is the Elijah that was to come, right? So, and Malachi puts that right at the end. So and then Elijah comes as the forerunner of Christ. So, is the Old Testament important? Absolutely. Absolutely. It reinforces everything we know. Without the Old Testament, the New Testament would have no basis or meaning. So is it important we know it? Yeah, it is. Does it get kind of boggy sometimes? Yeah, it really does. So, but I'm doing the best I can with it. So, so thanks for your time.